Hey guys, at the end of this video, Colin and I switch into Old English, which might be the first conversation between two advanced speakers of Old English in about 1,000 years. So definitely stick around for that, or if you want to skip to it, just navigate to the timestamps in the description and you'll be able to do so. Enjoy. So your book, Osweald Bera, turned 1 year old this past November. It is an Ørberg-style textbook for Old English. I don't think it's crazy to suggest that it's probably my number one recommendation for anyone who's beginning Old English, especially learning by themselves. No glaze, but it's a great textbook. But that term Ørberg-style book, people might not know what that actually means. I meet a large amount of people who have never heard of Familia Romana or anything like that. Could you explain what is an Ørberg-style textbook?
Sure. And so, yeah, if you haven't come up through the trenches of learning Latin, you probably have not encountered this term. So Hans Orberg was a Latinist and an educator who wrote a series of textbooks called Lingua Latina per se illustrata. So the Latin language illustrated on its own terms, or illustrated by means of itself. And so there's a whole series, but usually when people are talking about it, they're talking about the first entry, which is called Familia Romana, the Roman household. And it's a textbook that is entirely written in Latin, and it's a reader more than a traditional textbook. So it's not going to focus on grammatical explanations. It does have them, but it backgrounds them in favor of telling a story. And the story that it tells is progressive in the sense that it starts out with just a very small subset of the language and gradually adds to that as you go through the book. So by the end of the book, you're reading prose that approaches the kind of thing you would read in authentic texts. So the idea is to have a very gradual and easy transition into reading Latin from scratch. And the way to do this is to basically drip out the new material that you encounter, that the reader encounters chapter by chapter. And so if you read through Familia Romana and you really get everything that it has to give you, then you're in a good position to start looking at some authentic texts, especially some of the easier ones.
Yeah, so the first page, the first sentence of the book is of the Latin textbook that is pretty iconic, just Roma in Italia est. The city of Rome is in Italy. And, I've shown this book to my wife, who doesn't know anything about ancient languages. I mean, she knows as much as I think the average person would. But when she reads this first page, there's a picture of Italy and it's got Rome right in the middle, Roma, and the first sentence is Roma in Italia est. And there's a bit of cheating, I guess, in that most English speakers already know what in means. I think most Indo-European speakers probably already know what in means. And then est does kind of look like is. But it's very obvious that it means Rome is in Italy. And so the first sentence is intelligible to anyone who doesn't know Latin. And then I think the entire first chapter, you don't really have to know any Latin whatsoever. It's just talking about Rome is here, Italy is a peninsula, and that kind of thing.
The Po is a
Then
small river.
exactly, yeah, exactly. So from a like a sort of teacher's perspective, how is this sort of the way to learn a language? Because it's not the most common method in ancient language learning. So why does this work essentially?
It works because the primary engine of acquiring a language. So when I say acquiring a language, what I mean is acquiring the unconscious tacit knowledge, the kind of instinct for what works in a language and what doesn't, the kind of thing that you have in your first language. The way to acquire this is by consuming a lot of what people call input, but really this just means messages in the language. So this could be spoken, this could be written. Um, and the key aspect of this, the thing that actually seems to make the process happen, is decoding meaning. So when you're focused on what the text or the spoken message is trying to convey to you, your mind is occupied on working out the meaning, and this seems to have the side effect of building up this rich and abstract mental representation of the language. And this is the kind of thing that underlies our ability to produce and comprehend our first language and most people who study second language acquisition think that a similar thing goes on with, every language but our first.
Hmm. So then how would you describe the competing the sort of competitor method, the grammar translation method, sometimes referred to as the traditional method, but a lot of my colleagues push back on that because apparently it is actually newer than the sort of spoken that sort of method. How would you describe this other more predominant method of language learning?
The Yeah, it's interesting. Like so many things we call traditional, it came about in the Victorian age.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but so the other method that is often called grammar translation or the boring way or whatever, there's a lot of polemic around it. But essentially, the idea is that the gold standard of knowing a language is being able to analyze the grammar and translate it into your first language. And so this is really what the method stresses. So a textbook that's written in this method will typically include a short reading passage and then a long discussion of grammar, a collection of vocabulary words and their translations into whatever the language of instruction is. And all of this, by the way, will be written in the language of instruction. So if you're in an English speaking environment, it'll be written in English. The only content in the target language you'll get will be that short reading passage, or perhaps a few exercises which are isolated sentences which you're supposed to translate into English or the language of instruction. And the big difference between these two things is if you consider the perspective of second language acquisition, that has this consensus view that the dominant activity that builds the representation in your mind of the language is consuming messages. The messages, the number of messages, the sort of the sheer quantity of text in the language that you're reading is very small in the grammar translation method. And instead, what you're doing is taking a very small, isolated, really devoid of context selection of the language and rendering it into the language of instruction, which is interesting. And I'm sure it has something, but it's not the primary thing that builds up your knowledge of the language. Whereas if we contrast that with what's going on in an Ørberg-style book, it has different names: reading method, direct method, natural method, whatever. Um, Again, a lot of these names are kind of polemic, but what you get is a huge quantity of text by comparison. And just by spending, say, 10 hours studying a language in that method, a larger percentage of your time is going to be spent doing the core activity, which is decoding messages, compared to this grammar translation method, where a very small percentage of that time is spent decoding messages. So, I often talk about it in terms of nutrition. Decoding messages is like you know, your main course, and the grammar instruction are like vitamins. You don't want to be without vitamins entirely, but if your main diet is vitamins, there's probably something wrong with your nutrition.
That's a great analogy. So I won't ask you to pit Oswald Bera against any other book, but what would you say was the best textbook in Old English before it came out?
Um, I have a real soft spot for Mitchell and Robinson, A Guide to Old English, because that's what I first found at a garage sale as a teenager, and it was my induction into the world of Old English. I like it a lot because when you read um, when you read Mitchell's other work, you really see the depth of philological knowledge that is condensed into this textbook, which is for beginners. Um, in many ways, it's not for beginners, though. It gives you everything you need, but you're going to need to supplement that with a lot of reading in order to flesh it out. So it's a textbook that works somewhat in this grammar translation tradition, although I would say it's almost an earlier tradition that most Old English textbooks tended to follow in the 19th century, which is give you an entire grammar of the language in part A, and then give you some texts to read in part B. And I actually think this is a better approach than say like the Wheelock's Latin approach, which is probably the most popular grammar translation textbook for Latin, which is divided into lessons, and each lesson has the few sentences to translate, point of grammar, maybe a very, very short reading. So I honestly think that the Old English was a little bit ahead of the state of the art in Latin before Orberg,
Yeah,
anyway.
I totally agree. I was also brought up on Mitchell and Robinson. My old English professor at university, his father was good friends with Fred Robinson. They taught together at Yale, and so he is a big fan of Fred Robinson, and made us read this book together to learn the language. But that first half of the grammar instruction at times is so opaque. Especially with Bruce Mitchell's obsession over syntax, there are just chapters and chapters where, to someone who isn't very well educated on linguistics already, it's like impossible to read. And certainly, I only very recently has it become sort of intelligible to me. When I was first a student, my teacher told me to read that part, and I was just like, I don't understand anything that I'm reading right now. It was all just total nonsense to me, talking about like parataxis and verb clauses and stuff like that. Like I was 19, which isn't to say that a 19-year-old can't understand things like parataxis, but I hadn't learned anything about linguistics yet. I was just starting out, and there were all these big words that were way too confusing. What was more helpful to me, I think, were their example sentences in the beginning of their readings. Like, for example, I think it was Bruce Mitchell and Fred Robinson that came up with the "Harold is Swift" sentence, the sentence that is both Old English and Modern English at the same time. He's "Hond is strong" or something like that, where it looks like Modern English, but it is actually a good Old English sentence. That I think was much more helpful and a very creative approach. And of course, all those texts were fully glossed and had all these notes and stuff. And then, of course, I also really like Fulk's textbook. What do you have any opinions on it?
Um, I came to it at a point where I wasn't really the target audience anymore.
Mm.
So I never really evaluated it as a learner. Of course, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan. I really enjoy folks' work in general, but as a textbook, I don't have strong opinions on it.
Yeah, it's very like Wheelock style. So the reason I like it is because it's the most accurate phonologically. But it is, I mean, I assigned it to one of my students before your book had come out when I was teaching Old English. I was like, it was one of my first classes, and I was like, all right, guys, here's the textbook that you can read. It's free, it's online. And one of my students responded that he had attempted to read it, and a couple hours later, his body was found washed up on the shore a couple miles down the street.
Well, one textbook that I would recommend actually is actually Henry Sweet's First Steps in Anglo-Saxon, which is one of these Victorian textbooks. I'm hesitant to recommend it because some people have a bit of an allergy to, going and looking at old yellowed pages of scans on Internet Archive. But if you don't have an allergy to old books, then you might enjoy Sweet's First Steps in Anglo-Saxon, which is of the Victorian two-part primer variety. So you have your basic grammar of the language. It's a very stripped down grammar of the language compared to his other Old English textbooks. But then the second half is a reader, which is adapted authentic texts. And they are probably still too hard for a complete beginner, but they're the best thing that I think is out there because the spelling is normalized, so you're not having to wonder, what word am I actually seeing? There are all sorts of lovely notes, and the every bit of the grammar and vocabulary that's in those texts is explained elsewhere in the book. So if you use it right, you can sort of scaffold your way up. So I think that's probably the best resource, although I'd hesitate to call it a textbook per se, in the sense that we're used to today.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book too, and it was very widely published, so you can find it in a lot of used bookstores. I think I have like 3 copies at this point because I buy it whenever I see it. It's a good gift, but it's one of those red hardcover Oxford books with the sigil on the bottom. Really pretty book. So if anyone sees it when they're out, I would definitely recommend buying it because it's a good have, even if you're not going to use it to learn. Okay, with all that said, that's the state of Old English learning before Osweald Bera. When did you decide that you wanted to write something like that?
It was 2017. Um, I had been interested in second language acquisition. So my background is I'm a linguist, but more of the theoretical variety. My training is in theoretical syntax, morphology, phonology. And I only came to the more applied linguistics after grad school. And I got really interested in how the linguistic theories that I'd studied and sort of cut my teeth on interacted with the fact, how the facts of how we learn language. And the core thing that unites the two preoccupations is how abstract language is. So our knowledge of language, of any language, is very abstract. The kinds of rules that we have in grammar books describe the behavior of language, but they are not necessarily the things we know. So there are all sorts of strange facts about grammar that we know, but we don't know we know. So, for example, in modern English, um, I ate bread and cheese. It's a fine statement. If someone doesn't maybe hear what you ate, they can say, "What did you eat?" And you can answer, "I ate bread and cheese." If they only miss the last word in the sentence, they can't, for whatever reason, ask, "What did you eat bread and?" That doesn't seem to work as a modern English sentence, despite the fact that it's extremely comprehensible what it means. But nevertheless, there's some weird bit of English grammar that forbids that kind of question. So, what is that? What is the nature of that knowledge? This is what linguists, get all excited about and write papers about. And they come up with these crazy theories that involve gigantic syntactic trees and things that you can't even print on a sheet of paper because they're so elaborate. So you have to go click through to the website and download a big picture of them. They're very abstract and they're not something that you would be able to glean just from casually thinking about language. And they're certainly not something that you'd be able to teach in a textbook to beginners. But nevertheless, these abstract rules get acquired in the normal course of events by learners. And so there has to be what is going on there? How is it that we acquired this language, this tacit language that we don't even really understand that we have? And so that got me looking into the second language acquisition literature, where I found the answer is that what we discussed earlier, the decoding of messages is the activity that stimulates the growth of this knowledge of language. It's more like growing a plant than anything else. You provide it with the nutrition, which is these messages, which is called input in the literature. You provide it with input, and it grows seemingly on its own. And I thought, okay, well, what would language instruction look like if we actually took that seriously? And people have, I'm not the first one to have asked this question. People in many modern languages have been working on this for decades now, and they've produced really good resources for some of these modern languages. However, historical languages tend to be, something of an afterthought in this line of work. So I thought, what would the instruction of a language that I'm really interested in look like if we actually took second language acquisition seriously? And I have a lot of languages I'm interested in. It's sort of an occupational hazard of being a linguist, but I ended up settling on Old English, which had been a long-standing love of mine since that garage sale find many years ago. And I set about writing the textbook that I thought should exist. And it turned into Osweald Bera.
Yeah. So to rewind a bit, you teach at ALI, the second best online language learning school, and all in good fun. Obviously, they're great. But how did that start? How did you get involved with them? You obviously started teaching Old English with them, and that seems to have been at least one of the motivating factors for you to develop this book. What is the origin story of that?
So I was working on the book. This was during COVID. I was working mentally. I hadn't really written anything, but I was working out what kind of book it was. I knew it was going to be about a bear. I didn't know the details yet, and I was reading a lot of second language acquisition stuff, and I was sort of thinking through it all on Twitter. And I would post things, and at one point, I think it was in 2022, um, the people at ALI, Ancient Language Institute, got in touch with me and said, "Hey, it looks like you think about these matters kind of like we do. We should chat." And we did, and turns out we did think about these matters in a very similar way. And they said, "Well, listen, you're working on this Old English project," and that by then I'd had some like early drafts of chapters and on my machine. He said, "Would you be interested in actually testing that. We can provide a platform for you to test how the book is to teach. And I said, well, there's a thought. I had done a little bit of Old English teaching before that, but I was just sort of bricolaging materials together as I could, like using things like Sweet and whatnot. And I thought, this is a fun opportunity. Let's do it. And so I started teaching Old English with them before the book was done. So I had these sort of, rough PDFs and things, and I was furiously trying to stay ahead of my students and getting out of class. Oh, great class. We'll see you next week. And then writing the
Yeah.
chapter that was three ahead of them, so I could give them a little bit of runway, or I had a bit of runway to stay in front of them. And through that process, I ended up finishing the book, and then revisions, editing, all that kind of stuff, all happened while I was teaching. But what's fun is those first students who'd read through that early version of Oswald, they needed more things to do, and so I started teaching them. I started going through authentic text with them, first prose, then poetry. Then we did a year-long slow read of Beowulf together, which was a lot of fun. And now we're doing stuff like verse composition, and now they're getting interested in Old Norse. Yeah, it's dangerous stuff.
Verse composition is really interesting. I'll have to ask about that later. But to stay on topic, so you then started teaching Old English, and I remember seeing an interview of yours with Luke Rainieri where you were discussing the sort of conversational aspect of that, which was, we've talked about this before, you and I one on one, but that was a super inspirational moment for me because I had been speaking Latin for a while, but I had never even considered the fact that people could do that with Old English, which was, of course, the primary language that I was studying when I was in university, at least. And I see Colin Gorrie talking about how he teaches Old English in Old English, conversationally. Where do you, however, begin? Because there, as far as I'm aware, there was no precedent whatsoever. I mean, in Latin, people have been speaking Latin for the past 2,500 years. There was never a day in the last 2,500 years where no one spoke Latin. Even in the 19th century, you still had like the Jesuits teaching in Latin and stuff like that. But for Old English, it actually is a dead language. Like there actually was a several centuries where no one was speaking it. So where did you start? How did you kind of start taking steps forward?
I started with the idea that the language is more than the texts. So, and this is, I think, in some circles, kind of controversial. Um, Jackson Crawford has talked about this on in some of his videos that there's a sort of heretical idea that one would invent sentences that are not attested in the corpus. But to me, this seems very, very sensible because the modern English language, is not the collection of modern English texts. That's actually a key insight of modern linguistics is that there is a sort of generative process that whose output is texts and messages, but the language can't be reduced to the totality of the text in the language. So if that is true, and what the language is this mysterious abstract knowledge that I keep putting here in the screen for some reason, but that's what the language is, this knowledge of the language. If that's the knowledge, if that's what the language is, then you could, in theory, recreate it by the right kind of process of decoding messages and getting lots of input. You could recreate it or something very close to it, and then use that to generate new messages and new texts. And that's the sort of the reason why this is an intellectually defensible project, at least in my opinion. So I thought, okay, let's give it a try. And let's start with simple things like asking what this is and what that is and where this person is in this, in the context of reading a story, you might see, it would be an example. Mus i son felda. Mus i son felda. A mouse is in a field. Where is seu mus? Where's the mouse? Seu mus i son felda. Great, the mouse is in the field. And you start with these very simple sentences, and then you go furiously into the texts and you try and find examples of people doing similar things, and you get to learn a lot of the corpus this way because you're going through all sorts of out of the way things. You're reading the translation of the Gospels, you're reading the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, you're reading poetry, you're reading everything. that you can get your hands on to try and find some precedent that the way you phrased it is correct. And then half the time you find it's not. And then you say, okay, data point, reformulate. And then your knowledge of the language, that abstract knowledge of the language, also changes in that process. And it becomes, in theory, at least more like what they had, 1,000+ years ago. And so you keep doing this process iteratively. And when you have students, you have a real incentive to try and like do it as best you can and as quickly as possible. And you just build from there. And eventually you find that you can express some fairly sophisticated concepts, or at least ask some questions, sophisticated questions in the language. And yeah, it's if we were to have an Anglo-Saxon appear before us, I'm sure that he or she would say, that's a bit of a weird way to phrase it, but I think that we are not in our recreation in sort of Neo Old English. I think we are not so far away that we have a noticeably different language than they would have written in. At least we don't really know how they would have spoken, but that's a different topic.
Yeah, that's often the sort of example that I give as well, is that if I were transported back in time to mid 10th century Wessex, and I was having a conversation with King Alfred the Great, like I think actually that wouldn't be mid 10th century Wessex. You get what I mean. If I was having a conversation with some random person on the streets, they might definitely react strangely to the way that I sound. I mean, the pronunciation, as hard as I try, could never be. We have no idea really how they inflected things. We can only sort of give our best guess. How I sound would probably be weird. How I phrase things would probably be weird. But I think they would understand me, and I think I would be able to understand them as well, which is so cool to be able to think about. But anyway, so when you then set out to speak in Old English, what are the kind of first, you mentioned asking about what something is, these sort of simple questions like, so moose is on Felda. What are the kind of first building blocks of conversation that you need to not only discover for yourself, but also then teach to students?
So I think that the information passing aspect of language, the information passing function of language is the most crucial to focus on, because this is where the encoding and decoding of messages really lives. I'm trying to convey something to you, a factual matter about the world or about an imaginary world in the case of a story, and you're trying to figure out what I'm saying. And in order to do this, you need to ask clarification questions. What did you say? Where was he? Why did he do that? So these kinds of questions, mostly WH questions, so these sort of content questions like what, who, why. I guess in Old English we call them HW questions. Um, but also yes and no questions, which are also very useful for confirming and staying on the sort of straight and narrow of, okay, we're negotiating this meaning between us in any conversation. And we want to make sure that we are sort of in this conversation living in the same shared mental reality. And so there's all sorts of back and forth that goes on in a conversation in any language to make sure that happens. And yes, no questions are an important part of that. So these kinds of things, I think, are the basis and the foundation of conversation in historical language. I think that social niceties and things like thank you, good to see you, all these kinds of expressions that don't really convey information about the world, but they sort of moderate and manage the social relationship are important as well, but they're of secondary importance because A, they're really, really hard to find authentic ways to express in a historical language generally, unless, I mean, Latin is kind of an exception because of the text that we have access to, but in Old English, we don't really have access to the kind of texts like dramas and things like that that would give us that kind of information. And so, we're on less firm ground when it comes to those kinds of expressions. And for that reason, I think they're a little bit less important to focus on at the very beginning. However, it is kind of nice to be able to maintain, I won't say total immersion, but to maintain a large majority of the time that you spend in a conversation in Old English or the target language. So if you can do that by adding some of these little, um, greasing the social wheels sort of expressions, that's good. Another thing is in a classroom management speech is also important. So what does that mean? Can you say that again? Um, I don't understand. How do you say this in the past tense? These kinds of things are also really good so that you don't have to dip out so often into modern English. And that's the
Yeah.
rough order that I would go in.
I don't want to misquote him, but I think I remember Andrew Morehouse, who, of course, with his wife also runs Latinitas Animi Causa, saying that one of the reasons he thinks those kinds of how are you questions are important is because as long as you're not just saying it to say it, like, oh, how are you? Okay, great. Next question. Like if you actually ask that and then, let's say they say, oh, I didn't sleep very well. And then next week you ask like, oh, how are you? I know you didn't sleep very well last time. Like that whether or not they notice it, sends a subliminal message of like this person is actually listening to me. They're actually listening to me. They actually care about how I'm like, and they're not thinking perhaps. I mean, they probably are, but they're not entirely thinking of like what is the correct grammatical way to phrase the answer that I'm going to give. They're thinking like, oh yeah, like I didn't sleep very well last week, but now I'm sleeping better. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so those sort of basic health-based, like udwales questions, to use the Latin expression, are sort of, pedagogically very useful in that regard. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I do. And what I find is interesting, and this is something that actually Luke Ranieri has talked about in the context of ancient Greek, is that you might think that these sort of daily life phrases are kind of, we're reading about the great deeds of heroes. We don't need to know about, sneezing and things like that. But actually, there's this sort of Bader-Meinhof effect, which is this kind of priming effect where once you learn, you focus on something, you see it everywhere. And this is doubly true with language. So what you do, you learn the word for sneeze and, it's cold outside, it's rainy. And then you see in your poems of epic heroes, people sometimes sneeze and it's rainy and foggy outside. And so this vocabulary actually does come up a lot. Even if you are reading about the most rarefied and, lofty philosophy, it is important. So I think, I won't say I don't think it's the first thing that you would focus on if you're sort of building this up from scratch, but it's, a close second or third.
Yeah, my friend Corey Russo, who's also one of the teachers at Latinitas Animi Causa, he does a lot of recordings of Latin texts, and I think I was listening to Sallust, if I'm not mistaken. I might be misquoting this, but Sallust, it's just I think it was the Catalonian conspiracy, and at one point he just kind of pauses and says like, "Sed tamen mea sententia," like, but however, in my opinion, and in that moment, like that's so commonly said by Latin speakers that I've interacted with, like that phrase, like, but in my opinion, that kind of thing, that it almost kind of took me out of the reading of the recording where I was like, oh my God, that's so like realistic. That's so like it means something to me, I think shortly after I began speaking Old English, really attempting to learn how to communicate in it, I was reading Beowulf, and I think it was the part where it was describing Grendel, um, uh, that he arvoðlíce þragi þóre, that he sort of, it was very difficult for him that the time where he was observing the Hall of Heorot and their mirth and merriment. And I had just been having a conversation like a couple hours prior about how, oh yeah, like that is arvothe, like, oh, each arvoðlíce on English sprekan mij, like it's very difficult for me to speak in Old English. And in that moment, like I was like, I just used this word, and it wasn't necessarily that meta, but I just like felt actually like in my person what arvoðlíce meant. Like okay, it's difficult, and it's so much more impactful than just like knowing what that word means, because I've actually used it to express my own emotions. I don't know if you've ever had a moment like that.
Also true, and also with Beowulf, that's the each way. I think that comes up. I don't remember exactly it might be in the Sea Warden scene. But anyway, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, um, you have to say this all the
Oh,
time.
yeah. I think it's Tacit Wayne habit. Is that it?
That's its Wayne Habbe in. But anyway,
Oh
you
no, that's
can.
what Hrothgar says. Yeah, yeah, I'm sure it's in there somewhere.
Yeah, it's in there somewhere. Anyway, but this is a something that you need to say all the time because you only do know so much, right? So someone will ask, "How do you say this in Old English?" And I say, Uh, man ska se John Quatlego testa each way. Of the testa each way happy. Great. You have now like occupied the same mental space as a speaker of Old English. It's like you're sort of like reaching out and high-fiving over a millennium because you just
Yeah,
said the exact same thing in the exact same context that they would have said. And that's really cool.
yeah. It's really bothering me that I can't remember what exactly that line is. Because he says, "Nor shall there be any sort of like," when Beowulf is talking to the Coast Guard. Are you looking it up now?
Yeah.
Okay, that actually will make me feel so much better if you could tell me what exactly the line is and stuff.
Um, okay, so Thas each Wene is in 272. Nishal Thardurne sum Wezon, Thas each Wene.
Okay, okay, yeah.
But what you're
Because
thinking
yeah,
of is Hinne hali god for Arstavum uson sende to
Uson Sende, yeah.
Westinum Thas each Wen
Hmm.
habbe, which is 383.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
So both
I
of these things are attested, and you can use either of them. Awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty great. I actually I hesitate to say that I still do because it's been honestly almost a year since I've really exercised it. I used to have the first third of Beowulf memorized. That was like kind of my party trick. And it really influenced the way that I spoke in Old English because it was just so easy to recall, these sort of phrases and stuff, which might be a bit anachronistic because again, if I'm going to mid 10th century Wessex and saying things like uh, using like SVO word order, no SOV word order and stuff like that, and phrasing all these like poeticisms, that might actually cause them to look at me kind of weird.
I think this is exactly equivalent to someone who learns Japanese from anime and then going to
Yes, yes,
Japan
yes,
and
yes.
speaking like that. But and this is something, if you follow Matt versus Japan, who talks a lot about this, like there's something still very important in there, which is you're speaking Japanese. And you can then, no, we can't because we can't go to ninth century Wessex. But if you go to Japan, you'll get straightened up pretty quickly and you'll start to speak more like a normal person. If you're at that level where you can speak like, you can imagine someone speaking English like they've only just watched movies. And so they end up speaking like, Bruce Willis in Die Hard. Bruce Willis speaks English. So you've already gone 99% of the way to your goal. You just need to then maybe speak a little less like Bruce Willis in Die Hard in normal situations at a bank or in the grocery store. But that's still an extremely great achievement, in my opinion. So I don't worry too much about that. And because also when people worry about these things, it, any barrier, we just want to get rid of. Barrier to speech, barrier to enjoying the language. So I don't know. My point of view is that whatever, whatever.
Yeah.
Speak like Beowulf if you want.
Yeah, the analogy that I give is similar is that like imagine you gave someone like Romeo and Juliet, um, you know, Milton's Paradise Lost, and then like all of the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, and then like told them like this is what you have to learn English, and then like send them out into New York and like go have some conversations,
Well,
you
this
know?
happened to Borges, more or less. This is what
Oh,
Jorge
really?
Luis Borges did. He learned English through literature and only later in life came to an English speaking country. And he was like, what? This is English? People talk like this? It's a funny story. Imagine like someone who's only ever read great literature and then, meets some construction workers and tries to ask them for directions. Be
Yeah,
a fun scene.
I'm going to be faced with the opposite problem soon as I have a meeting coming up. I'm meeting some German expats at a local coffee shop, and it's going to be one of the first times that I'll actually get to talk with a real life German person up close and personal. And all of the German that I've learned has been from like TikTok. So I'm going to be, I imagine most of them are in their 40s at least, 50s. These are probably like Gen X, maybe baby boomers. And all I know how to say is like, yeah, das ist scheiße, Digga. Like all I know how to say is like, slang that Gen Zers on TikTok say. So I have to actually over the next couple days really sit down and remember how to like speak like formal German and stuff. We would have the opposite problem, I think, in Old English.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder what like I don't know if you have an opinion on this, what sort of filler phrases or like filler words were like in Old English. Like things you know, some of my friends have suggested like swilche, meaning like just
Mm.
like, you know, like swilche, swilche, swilche. Have you ever thought about that?
Yeah. The one thing that I've noticed I do is say M,
Mm.
like an Irish person might. And I thought, why do I do that? That's weird. It just sort of came out of the deep. I don't know why. And then I thought, well, it's probably because my instinct is to say and is not a sound in Old English. So what am I going to do? I'm going to sort of put that into the closest sound that I can get, which ended up being eh. Um, but yeah, as far as like more like lexical fillers, more like actual words, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, sometimes, sweeter,
Hmm.
off sweeter, if I'm doing like a course correction or something like that. But no, I haven't actually thought swilche is good. I like that. Sometimes I use nu because you see nu in like all sorts of Germanic languages used for various purposes, like in Scots and in Yiddish. And so I figure English probably had, I mean, we still have now used in certain contexts. The
Yeah.
contexts are a bit different in different languages, but I think something like nu would have been used for as a discourse particle, we might say,
Mhm.
in Old English as well.
Yeah. Well, okay, back on topic then. When you've taught these sort of basic building blocks of conversation, uh, what have you seen is generally the progression then in students? Like, what are generally the kinds of like first advanced sentences that you see them making or try to encourage them to make?
It's interesting. What you get is with this method, at least in my experience, is you get really, really rapid progress in comprehension, and then progress in production is much slower.
Mm.
Especially accuracy of forms, um, things like getting all the case endings right, strong and weak adjectives and things like that takes time. This also is true whether you do it the other way. But I argue that if you're using grammar translation, you're going to have a slow progress of being able to produce forms, and you're going to have slow progress of comprehension as well. So you're always going to have this gap between production and comprehension. Um, Comprehension is always going to be higher than production, just like I sometimes joke, you can read great literature in English, but you can't write it. It's the similar, similar phenomenon. Um, but what happens is that people start to take sentences that they've read and do variations on it. So they, for some reason, they cotton on to one way of expressing something. Um, um, so thinking, we talked about this phrase in Beowulf, "Das ich wen habe,"
Hmm.
as far as I have expectation, something like that. Then you might get someone being like, well, maybe I can use that for something else. Maybe I can use that for hope. I guess wing can also mean hope, but if they want to use Hicht, das ich Hicht habe, they might try that. And then you think like, huh, that feels good, but is that attested? I don't know. But anyway, you're in the middle of a conversation, you're not going to interrupt them. So you see these sort of variations on a theme things where people go from uh, a sort of chunked, um, where whole phrase comprehension, like they just know the phrase means this, they don't analyze it. And then you get people analyzing the phrase and flips, changing an each to a thu, changing one of the nouns, changing the verb. And so this is, I think, what you see first before you see large scale sort of assembly of complex sentences out of individual word units, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And then the last thing in that vein that I wanted to ask about, you mentioned verse composition. So when I have composed verse in Old English, at first, the first couple poems I wrote were before I had memorized 1,000 lines of Beowulf, and I was just sort of I had the rules of meter on my left. I had like all of my dictionaries and thesauruses and stuff like that on my right, and then I would just like try to like grind something out. But now, when I compose poetry in Old English, it's it is almost exactly what you might expect from the phrase like formulaic composition. In that, like I have all of these lines in my head, and I just kind of pull them out and try to make them fit what I'm trying to say, which might be accurate, might be anachronistic. We don't really know. How do you go about sort of instructing this verse composition?
Oh, yeah, it's a really interesting process. What I did in the course, so I taught this course in last summer, and what we started with was, um, or was it last fall? I forget. Anyway, it was last year at some point. What we
Yeah.
started with was modern English, because you can make modern English poetry using Old English metrical rules, like Tolkien did, for instance. And I think it's easier for people to get their heads around the the Cephas types and all of that kind of stuff in modern English. Um, so the principle of like learning one thing at a time. So put the language on easy mode, easier mode, and focus on the meter. And then once you've internalized the patterns of the meter, then go back to Old English and work that way. But I really focused on formulae because the from my perspective, formulae is a way to basically make it so that you only have to write half the poem. You only have to compose half the poem. You always have a formula on hand to finish your line, or if you start with the
Mhm.
formula, then you've constrained yourself to a point where it's pretty easy to finish the line, or at least comparatively so. But what I had people do was start with translation. So we took some of Paradise Lost, we took Ozymandias, we took these and because they're on the kinds of themes that Old English poets in fact did write a lot about. The transience of earthly power, and I mean Milton basically just the Genesis A and B, in early modern English. Um, so there was lots of stuff for them to mine in the original material, and yeah, we had a lot of fun doing that. It was really hard, but and the Seavers tapes were really really hard to like get a sense of. But somewhere around halfway through the semesters, or just 14-week semesters, it just clicked for them. Like they'd just seen so many of these different types of lines over and over again. They'd read so many poetry because I was also forcing them to read a bunch of poetry alongside this. It's like this is your input, and then here's your output. And then they just started writing all these amazing Old English poems. And we did. I had assigned like write a poem about an object that you like, and write it in the style of the Exeter Book Riddles, or write a poem about a modern day saint, and write it like Alfred's rhythmic prose, Saints' Lives. It was great fun. I can't wait to do it again. And through the process, we worked out a gigantic list of formulae that are all categorized by how they alliterate and things like that. So I think you really get a sense for what the education of a shop would have been like. Would have
Mhm.
had, we did that in 14 weeks, and they worked really hard for that. Think of what someone would be capable of who had studied it for years and years. Like Beowulf is the answer to that question.
Yeah, for sure. Last question that I'm going to ask before we switch into Old English. A beginner wants to set out in Old English. All they have is Osweald Bera, maybe a working computer with access to the internet. How do they do it?
So what I'd recommend is first of all, go look up a video on the pronunciation. There's no pronunciation guide in Oswald itself because it's awful to write those things. But just go online and search what the pronunciation is, and you'll get. I even have a video about that. I'm sure you have plenty of videos about that. Um, get the pronunciation so that you have like something relatively close in your mind playing while you're reading, and then go through and read the chapter, say the first chapter, all through, and make a note of whatever you don't understand on the side. Then at the end of each chapter, there's a little glossary of all the new words introduced. Uh, write down the modern English translations or anything that you learn from going through the vocabulary. Then go back and read it again, and cross out anything that you now do understand and see what's left at the end. And if there's something grammatical, then maybe go out and look online. There are all sorts of good Old English grammar resources online. If there's something that you're curious about, search there and progress in this way. I would say progress to the next chapter once you're above sort of 95% comprehension of everything. You don't need to understand absolutely everything, but it's good if you understand the vast majority, and then get on to the next chapter. And eventually you're going to get to a point where it's just you're being weighed down by all the new stuff. Because each chapter in Oswald introduces new vocabulary. And eventually that's really the limiting factor for learning languages. I find is vocabulary more than grammar. Some say grammar isn't a problem, but vocabulary is the problem that never goes away. There are always more words in a language, but there is a finite amount of grammar. Um, so you're going to find a point where you get weighed down. You're like, oh, this is getting to be a slog. Back to the start with you and read through and read all the way through, just not stopping because at this point you already understand all that stuff. And when you get to the point where you had trouble before, the probability is that you will not have trouble with it anymore because you're doing all the work of deepening the representations of the vocabulary from the earlier chapters that you had read, which is what the book is depending on for you to proceed. So you will now be able to proceed, even if you haven't learned the new words in that chapter. The fact that the new words in that chapter are the only things new to you will make your mind able to learn them relatively easily. There's a great demonstration of this. What does comprehension of a text look like at various levels at various percentages of words understood? So you take a modern English passage, like a 100-word passage, and you stroke out, you erase one word from it. Can you understand what's going on in this passage? Almost certainly. Get rid of 5. Can you understand what's going on in the passage? And you can actually do this and see how your comprehension drops. 5, usually you can still understand what's going on. Your mind can sort of triangulate from the rest of the words and the context what is probably said there. 10 words, you probably won't be able to understand what's going on. And then beyond that, it's just a complete disaster. So get yourself to the point where you can triangulate the meanings of the new words from context and then proceed forth. And so I would go through until you finish the whole book. And then by the time you finish the whole book, you can now go read the West Saxon Gospels. In fact, the West Saxon Gospels will be slightly easier than the end of Oswald. And then once you've read that, you can read pretty much anything. Poetry might be a little bit of a jump, but you'll be able to do whatever you want.
Yeah, that sounds like a plan. Okay, would you like to switch into Old English?
Utan sprekon in English.
Wees du, Colin, Hall.
On hall west du, Greihammer.
Who art du today?
Ich my well on whom ik du.
Ich am Swede Gold. Ich wille erst askian wenunga min forme frinung is this. Who saith mon, who maart thu, who art thu, what saith thu be thisum be tham?
Ich sedje oft who mich du, oder who mach du. Me likath swato sedjenne, ak ich sedje whilum ak what niwes mit the, what niwra spella saith du,
So
othe swelches what. When magon ak sedjon, to je wissum thinge who artu, ak ich not whether the that laie on Englishum bokum. Was du this?
ich habe hit anas isewen. Buton ich bel bepacht. Ich habe hit wenunga tua ak ich wene anas isewen. Und so dice hit I tak node on tharestoe. Who artu that is swa suci who is thin hale ac so dice on Latin we sejath utwales on that yataknath so dice who is thin hale that is who macht thu on so dice who macht thu ac yataknath who is thin hale that is arthu hal und so when each that wenige yif we sejath on word English who arthu. Und on English we habath yesewen that monside hu erthu. Each way that hui na sejen we hu erthu. Ac what wains tu, basically.
Ich twarie mit the, beswelchum thingum, ich ne sorge, that that me is heavigost je thought is that men spreken on English.
Mhm.
And if he said just what twego fremdes, nisit non Mitchell thing, that's each way.
Jesus soldier. Mi jam that's ythava. Is there book on English you written the is the levost?
Oh, well,
Hit is
to
erfod
ask us this says.
frinung. Other
Um,
wenung loud, other book, other watugu ritung.
Elra mast melikath Beowulf that leo thoradenne. For them the methinkt Beowulf monira radinga virde. Ak buton dam Melikiath alle leoth Swyddor thonne Gerade sprach. Um, Not each for wham hit bithswa on album sprachum the each learnie of the spreke ac what size tu bedissum.
Je rade sprach, sagst du?
Sodlice Gerade sprach that is on New English prose.
Ah, I saw the jet. Ac Welch's kindness.
Welches kynnes leoth?
Welch's kindness je rade sprache, Isa.
Sodlice. That sothis that melikath torradene, leoth torradene, swidorthonne gerades
Ah, du
prache.
sagst Swidor.
Sodlice. Ac no gerades prache is me ac god gethucht, melikath torradene tha wendinga thara thara halira gibrita.
Saw the jet.
Who said Jewish on English? Bitch.
Isa,
Swahi said just.
Isa.
Us kudat bitch. Halche bitch. No. We understand us.
Swa usa just page. Easy. Ac wenunga each said that me is lovre. Ah, hit is out of it. To said John, I saw the jet. For something easy each meliki ath leuth, alle leuth, or alle leuth. Saw the jet. Ac for something each really on English sprekan. Me is swida je hame to hlistienne to je hieranne min mine arene recordunga je vich that said on my what says the
Autograph?
yes so
Eh,
for huina
no.
ac each habe oh, Sanctus Augustinus jurat that the way nemnath soliloquiorum on English hit was wendod wenunga of kininge Alfrede ac wenunga
Wait,
na
no, no.
um, ac uh,
Twayon Bale.
mid twain nas that boot on twain wenunga mid twain ac easy that is good English soldier each have you saying that sume men tobusne Bruce Mitchell side that it were of laden wenunga what such each that it worth ladenode wenunga
Mm.
ac each what such each it's on sakia that each neum each that sithava it is good English and on each habitat recorded and each listie das swede oft and me is levre that to hierane von thon y lewth, soldier. Fwrdd am
Ah.
hit is swilche um, um, what such each heat helpeth on English to speak on.
So dice, ond ich wene swa beddam godspeldum ac.
Mm-hmm.
For them on no, hit is so
Alfriches.
that so dice.
Yeah,
Hit is so
Alfriches.
that thos syndon wendingliche, it's not, translation is, on summum stovum. This is so, ac each wene that manne mae manne mae to dalon laden of Englische.
Mm-hmm.
For them tha ilkan men Briton ba of the Briton on ba. And for them it is idel to onjinnenne to wel to virchenne betwelgstam sprachum.
Well side.
Thus waron munukas tha the Briton thinga mass they were habbat today on English i Britain. For
Mm-hmm.
them, he kudon laden of the hera mast. Na je nog be Alfred de Kuninge of the hera manie kudon on laden sprekon of the Briton. And for them melikiath tha godspel. For them ondam godspellum that ondam godspellum lidjath manie gode word tha de we magon of the thara de we magon nyttion on urresprache ac.
Mm-hmm. Easy, so the gym. On each shall said on act that each side of woch on each shall mean woch ritan each side of that heat was Alvriches Godspell so that je Alvrich self ne je went tha hagan ritunga thuast.
So
Good.
dice. Ac man saith oft Alfred Chess godspell. Sulce wese jot on English Kuninges Kuninges
Ah.
Jacobi so dice.
Easy, easy.
He
Each habit
he ne selva brat. Ich dice.
so dice. Ond ac, when unga kunning Alfred, when mag on that ac said on bei him. Min latestan frünung is merkt thu us a T1 thin rebok that is us Osweald Bera merkt thu when unga magon wit what to radan of them erstan of forman capital.
So dice. Ac ich shall on tynon fa bok ich vrite nu who shall it say John on English newe version
Ah.
newe utive edition that each wolde swidor at T1
Mhm.
ac where shall this be on?
Ich liege forthamfe we magon sejan wendung for thamthe we on English translatio seje ac versio of thamthe we habath version new version is ac wendung on
So
English.
dice
It is
for them for them come each on tweum ac ne, forgive me as the each
it is not.
seche for them it is on odrum other restowe
Easy.
ne.
That wilde iets ac bij vrienden ac thu wenungen ne shout nu on swarian ac ich wilde ask an jif monsaith biladiaeth ie me oedd y thilich. Hw saith man swa nis nacht oedd that nis the therf to asgian
Tätä
what's that
itseje
joy?
ne sorgadu. Ne
Ne
sorgadu.
sorgathu.
Ne sorgas not torguma.
Jesus,
Sordice.
what's that Beowulf side of the Hroðgar?
Beowulf
Beowulf side that
svaquath
Hroðgar.
hroðgare. Sordice. Fordam hroðgar. Hroðgare was swydde jomor
Jesus.
on mode. Und fordam Ashhere was of Slyen.
Alfred
Spoiler
Sunu.
alert. Und voor them kom Beowulf ut und no, hoe mich du Hroðgar? Hoe mij iets? Min freund is fort je within. Wat seist du freund? Ne sorgas not orguma. Voor them,
Jesus.
zeg ik. Ik zeg je swa.
It is good.
No, ik heb tha bok her. Mij iets min screen todalan.
Easy. Most thu?
Hit me quiz that each my the biddon that each je dale
Lalev. Each not. Who each my Nuthu most. Yif each.
god
Sweet God.
god no on tisse versione when nabath tha feiren anliknessa ac no we habath tha bokstavas on that is you noch no on onjenne that a bitch we habath that it's not who swato sedgene on English it is frame story no if du any rad os habe säg me
Na where Erdogan.
no ac hiton yin swa be lytlum meidene milthryth is je haten and hire fader no ich rade ich jiddie shall ich
Jesus, other
jiddion
stuff. We know.
on Englalonde is lytelton und unterm Tune is lytelhus und unterm Huse is lytelmeiden. How is Milthryth? Milthryth wonat unterm Huse. Here fader wonat äg där. Milthryth ville spell je hieron. Milthryth. Fader, ich ville spell je hieron. Here fader. Ich rätche spell. Welch spell rätchet Milthryth fader? Here fader rätchet Mitchell spell. If ich motsvar said John. His name is Osweald Bera. And this is that spell. And hit gath forth Oswald's spell to sedgenne. Ak thonne ich sedge her Mitchell, ich mene thy na lytel.
Easy. Hit is ak Mitchell. Hit is ak Swede Woldorlich. Nese?
Ich sedge
It
het
is.
bank.
And if mon will Burdur radan alle maron hit Bijan and each habe that what's that each Linche
Tach lenchon.
Lenchan easy on Dune
Und am underjevrite ich not.
Unterriorite easy so the huina good that is Al Colin Gorrie each thunk if a Swede liche that's the through her Kime and easy West Hall
Je lice. Wesa.